We're just going to need the lights to go on for a little bit during this part. Does everybody have this? Who doesn't have it? It should be in the back. Okay, turn it over. The puzzle. Everybody should have a pen. Can everybody see that puzzle? Because I can't without my glasses. But the light's okay? All right, I'm going to ask him to put 3 minutes on the screen. Perfect. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to get as many answers as you possibly can. Are we ready? What are they talking about enthusiasm? Are we ready?
Yes.
Let's start counting it down right now. Very good. Do I have to remind everybody no cheating? Two minutes. Less than 1 minute. 30 seconds. 20. 15. 10. 7. 3. 2. 1. Put your hands down. That's not part of the program. So how many people got 15? Raise your hand. How many people got 10? 5? 4? How many people got 2? 1? Who got none? Who got 0? Raise your hands high. Okay, be proud of that. I'm going to show you a little video about why you wouldn't even know the answers to this. Let's watch the screen.
My name is Will Shorts. I'm crossword editor for the New York Times. This puzzle has a special story behind it. Only one person knows all the answers. but she doesn't remember them anymore.
Alzheimer's is a devastating disease. We wanted to demonstrate its effects and show how the AFA can help. So we took a common hobby and transformed it into a way of experiencing the disease. First, we learned facts about patients' lives by interviewing their relatives.
My grandmother is Catherine. She had forgotten to feed the dog. She found a doll, named it. My dad's name is Richard. My name is Dad. Completely burned the fried chicken.
Then, we had Will Shorts create puzzles based on each patient's life and the answers they could no longer find. We worked with the biggest newspapers in the United States to have the puzzles covertly published, making enthusiasts struggle to find the simplest answers. In addition to the newspapers, a range of media drove people online, where they could learn more about how the AFA can provide support. We showed the effects of Alzheimer's through a crossword puzzle that not a single person can solve. We reached over 5 million newspaper readers, a total of 50 million adding other media. AFA saw a 159% increase in web traffic and another 62% in calls. And with unsolvable crossword puzzles, we helped many find the answers they needed.
So the whole purpose of this exercise was for a brief moment to allow you to experience what somebody with Alzheimer's or related dementia goes through: confusion, frustration, agitation. We were approached, AFA was approached a couple of years ago by a healthcare public relations firm in New York City called Area 23. And they just sent me a blanket email, and I'm sure we all get it, and I thought it was spam. So I contacted them, and they were legit. And they said, look, we've had a very successful career. We'd like to give back. We'd like to donate our services. But we want to do something that's going to challenge people. So they came up with this concept called the hardest crossword. It's a website right now that you can go to. What the hardest crossword is a series of questions of individuals and families of 3 people living with Alzheimer's disease right now. So you can't solve it. And to our success and credit of them, they were able to get Will Shorts, who's the editor of the New York Times Crossword Puzzles. And if you're an enthusiast, you know that his puzzles are challenging. And he jumped on board with this, and we were enormously grateful. And you could see how widespread all the ads that we were able to place in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Daily News, and other periodicals were at no charge, and they all gave back. Website, as you can see, we had enormous hits to our website, people going, which is good because it's one of the reasons why we were founded. I want to thank you again for being here. We'll go into a little bit about who we are at AFA as soon as the PowerPoint presentation comes up. So we were founded many years ago, and our mission was based on providing support, services, and education. We're very proud of the work that we do. We've been on a tour, and why are we here today? And this is our 3rd consecutive year that we've come back, because more than 120,000 people currently living in Tennessee have Alzheimer's disease, and more than 5 million people nationwide. And that number will triple by 2050, by 2060. But use a multiplier today. 120,000 people in this state have the disease. Use a multiplier of 3 or 4, because you need to have a team. And think about how prevalent and how widespread this is. Our whole purpose why we were founded is a place to turn to for guidance, support, and counseling. So who founded us? The caregiver. Back in 2002, his name was Mr. Bert Brodsky. His story is in the 80s and 90s. He lives in New York. His parents lived in Florida. And he saw some changes in them. So he wanted to put a healthcare worker in their house, and his mother resisted and kept saying, I can take care of your father, I don't need any help. So he went to a drastic step as he saw their health declining, and he sued his parents, and he took them to court. He walked into court, and he said it was one of the most devastating things he's ever done in his life. And his parents were on one side of the courtroom with his brother, and he was on the other side, and the judge said, Brodsky versus Brodsky, how much money is involved? And he said, Your Honor, there's no money involved. And he said, Mr. Brodsky, you're from New York, this is Florida. Anytime it's family against family, there's always money involved in Florida. He explained to him what he wanted to do, and just put a healthcare worker in the house. And the judge looked at his parents and said, please, don't let the court make a decision like this. Just, think about it. So Mrs. Brodsky's mom accepted it. Their health declined. He brought them up to New York. His mother had Alzheimer's disease, and he used to go out with his dad. Remember, this is the 80s and 90s at the time. Nobody spoke about Alzheimer's disease. The stigma then was greater than it still is today. There was no place to turn to for guidance, counseling, or support. So he wanted to find a place where people can go, and this is his family, to ensure that nobody makes, as he says, the mistakes that he made, because he had no place to turn to. So we founded AFA in 2002. And since then, we've grown into a national organization where we have more than 2,800 member offices nationwide, and some of them are here today. And we're very proud of the support that we receive. Our programs and services now include a national toll-free helpline that's staffed by licensed social workers 7 days a week. We have a national memory screening, partners in care, dementia care training program throughout the entire country. We're approved in 41 states to offering continuing education for licensed social workers. We also publish a quarterly magazine. If you don't get it, subscribe to it. It's free. It's packed with full information. Our website is alzfdn.org, and we offer free webinars every single month. This is our helpline number. It's free, it's confidential. Nobody's going to know that you're calling if you have any questions. The numbers are in your folders as well. To date, since the inception of our program, we've trained more than 19,000 professionals through our community and education programs, delivered support and counseling to tens of thousands of people on an annual basis, and since the inception of our National Memory Screening Program, we have screened more than 5 million people nationwide. So how many people are afraid to get screened today? Be honest, raise your hand. I was at one point. So when I first started with AFA 5 years ago, we had our first conference when I came on board in New York City. And the board chairman, who's the founder, is very active in the organization. He went and got screened. It's like, you have to do it, chicken. I said, I really don't want to do it. He says, you have to do it. So I went and got screened. I walked out, he says, how'd you do? I said, it's confidential. I can't tell you my score. He said, remember, I hired you. How'd you do? He told me his score, I was one less. I got it. But Amanda's going to, is Amanda here? Oh, she's right outside. She's the one who registered you. She's going to be offering screenings today. If you haven't signed up, take advantage of it. We're always proactive with certain parts of our health from the neck down. Let's think about a checkup from the neck up. It's critically important that you get a baseline of your cognitive skills. It's something that we advocate, and our first speaker will talk about the significance of it as well. When we were founded many years ago, the mission of the board of directors and the vision was to give back. We give back nearly $1 million a year in 5 grant cycles to support our member offices throughout the entire country. We also invest in research, and these are some of the research projects we're doing as far as Israel to New York and everything in between. We're very proud of the work. And just yesterday, I met with Dr. Newhouse, and Kate is here from Vanderbilt. We're going to be doing a community outreach project in northern Nashville and minority communities to ensure that they are aware of the education services that are applicable to this disease. We have a public policy division in Washington, D.C., and the whole purpose of that is to advocate for more funding for research and support for caregivers throughout the United States. Think about it. The cost today is more than $60,000 annually. Our public policy division is always beating down the halls throughout the Capitol, and to ensure, even though there's dysfunction in Washington today, I'm happy to say that this is the first year that more than $2 billion was awarded and budgeted for research, the first ever in the history of this country, and it's critically important if we are going to find a cure and even better treatment. A couple years ago, we started on an awareness initiative called Light the Nation in Teal. It became so successful that we started to have buildings throughout, historical buildings throughout the entire world, and these are some of them. And this year, the Country Music Hall of Fame will be joining us with buildings light up in teal, which is AFA's Alzheimer's awareness color. And this year, it's November 7th. We're very proud of the fact that more than 300 buildings will sign up throughout the entire country. Our tour started off early this year. We started it 2 years ago. We visited almost 40 states with our Educating America tour. I feel it's critically important that you know the services that are available and the best practices that are available to you as caregivers. It's not possible without financial support. We do not charge for these conferences. We are streaming live on Facebook, and to date, we've probably had about 40,000 to 50,000 people in the last 2.5 years view our conferences, which is critically important to us. But our work is never done, and at the end of the day, through the millions of people that we help every single day throughout the nation with our member organizations, we feel our work is never done because this disease has no discrimination and it never sleeps. So I appreciate you being here today. Some of the exhibitors that you saw today are here. Take advantage of the services that they offer, because this is what we want you to know. We want you to know that there are services that are available, and it's okay to seek help. So once again, I want to thank all of you for being here. We're very grateful. We have a great program lined up today. Our first guest speaker is somebody that's very close to AFA. He's part of our medical advisory board, and his name is Dr. Fred Schmidt. He's a professor of neurology, neurosurgery, psychiatry, behavioral science, and psychology at the University of Kentucky's Sandra Brown Center on Aging, one of the original 10 Alzheimer's disease centers funded by the NIA. He's also a member of AFA's Medical, Scientific, and Memory Advisory Board. Dr. Schmidt specializes in biostatistics, dementia, and HIV. He is the Mary Carter Award recipient for his work with patients with Down syndrome and neurodegenerative conditions, including Alzheimer's disease. He's a principal investigator and consultant, enormous grants from the NIH and other federal and state funding mechanisms. Ladies and gentlemen, it's really a pleasure to introduce a good friend, big supporter of AFA, Dr. Fred Schmidt.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I can't see you very well because of the bright lights, so if I get squinty, we can blame it on my allergies. How's that? So, this is my second visit to Nashville with the Alzheimer's Foundation of America tour, and I think they allowed me to come in 2017. I obviously didn't do a good job since they didn't invite me in 2018, or because I am at the University of Kentucky, you know, we have a little bit of rivalry with those people over in Knoxville. I think it's UT as it's known, and that rivalry tends to be there. But wherever I go, I always have to watch very carefully during basketball season. I have to always look behind my back because I did my training at Duke, which gets me in trouble in Lexington with the Kentucky fans. And I also had my first official faculty position at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So I'm not just a Blue Devil, I'm a Tar Heel and a Wildcat. And so I get very confused during basketball season. That's over, so I think I can give you this talk. So, my job is to squeeze about 120 years of research into Alzheimer's disease into an hour. So I'm going to move quickly. There'll be some areas I'll cover a little more carefully. And because I teach and I see patients at the hospital, it's the academic in me that will apologize because you do have a handout of my slides, but I couldn't leave them untouched for a week, so I messed with them a little bit. So there'll be a couple of slides that are out of order and a couple of new slides. My apologies. If you really, really want that information, we'll be happy to provide that. Now, when we think of Alzheimer's disease, those of us, and with my last name of Schmidt, you might understand that the fact that this started in Germany, this whole concept of Alzheimer's disease, started with Dr. Alois Alzheimer. And the first monograph was published in 1907 concerning this 58-year-old woman that's pictured here, who had been admitted to the hospital and was under Dr. Alzheimer's care. And she had dramatic symptoms. She was paranoid that her husband was cheating on her. She was forgetful. She couldn't cook anymore. She couldn't go shopping to get the food to cook. And so she was hospitalized. Of course, back then, we really didn't know what was going on. And after she passed away, Dr. Alzheimer was able to look at her brain tissue under the microscope. And one of the interesting stories, if you will, or legends, is that Dr. Alzheimer needed the help of a colleague, a fellow by the name of Bielszowski. And Bielszowski had just developed this new way of staining tissues, known as the Bielszowski stain. It used impregnated silver so you could see things under the microscope better. And lo and behold, when they put that brain tissue under the microscope, they were able to see the classic features of Alzheimer's disease, the senile plaque and the neurofibrillary tangle. Don't try to say that 3 times fast. I can't. These became the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. This is what we have seen in the brain since the early 1900s. And it was only 40 to 50 years later that we began to understand what those plaques and tangles were made of. We were able to identify the proteins, and that led to a major surge in research. Now, the best way to summarize this is to go with this newfound excitement that we have in the field. So when I started back last century, I won't say how long, of research in this area, we had a hard time determining what was Alzheimer's disease. Now this graphic that you do have in your handout really sets the stage of what is going on with Alzheimer's disease. And I tend to pace, you can imagine what my students have to put up with at 8 in the morning. But we know what the clinical stages are, everything from what we now call asymptomatic or prodromal or preclinical Alzheimer's through mild, moderate, and severe Alzheimer's. And here we might talk about mild cognitive impairment as well. We know that the brain changes are occurring throughout. So we start seeing changes in that tau protein and that senile plaque protein, the amyloid beta. We see other things going on in the brain, such as inflammation, oxidative stress, and so on. And this is all due to research since the 1980s that we begin to understand this. And because of that basic science work that's identified these things, we now have better tests, some of them that are still in research phases, that will help us identify those brain changes in Alzheimer's disease early. Now, why is that important? You may say, ivory tower research. Well, it's important because all of this work has been based on people who volunteer for research, who have Alzheimer's disease, or family members with Alzheimer's disease. And they volunteer for research so that we can look at all of these aspects of Alzheimer's disease. And so a lot of research is based on their generous gifts of themselves, including their brain and body and blood and spinal fluid and so forth, to researchers. The whole point of all this is to develop new therapies. And I'll talk a little bit about clinical trials in a bit. But as we understand more and more about what's happening in the brain, because of these changes in proteins and loss of connections, we're proposing newer and newer and newer therapeutic efforts. So far, what we've done up to now is we've tried to treat Alzheimer's disease once the symptoms are present, and we have, interestingly, a number of medicines that help change the symptoms. We improve memory a little bit, we improve function a little bit. But sadly, the symptomatic improvement with our current medicines is all that we can get. The disease continues to march forward. And so these medicines will help for a while, and then the disease takes over. So the best way to think of this, because as we study these proteins, we've gotten excited with these new tools that we have. And so Dr. Cliff Jack, and Dr. Vermurray did a nice summary where they say, what's happening is that abnormal tau protein increases early, long before people show symptoms. Then we get this tau protein change, and then we get changes in the brain structure, and then memory and thinking goes. So all of this is happening, as I showed in that previous slide, 10, 20 years before the person actually shows changes in memory and thinking. Before they show those symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, of forgetfulness, of personality change. So we now know that the changes that result in Alzheimer's disease happen years before a person is symptomatic. So think of this as a person who is in their 60s or 70s right here, and then go back 10, 20 years, 40s and 50s. And what's amazing is, back when I started, we had no brain scans. We used pneumoencephalograms, which meant that you got stuck in an x-ray machine and we pumped air into your skull so that we could actually see what your brain looked like. Quite a painful process. Often, because we didn't know in those days, the only way to diagnose Alzheimer's disease remains the autopsy, so you can look at the tissue under a microscope. We actually did brain biopsies. So we would surgically go and take a tiny little bit of the brain so that we could try to diagnose Alzheimer's. This is back in the 70s and 80s. Things have changed. We now have MRI scans. And for the longest time, these changes in the MRI that you see here, you can see the dramatic shrinkage of the brain, going from a normal person in their 70s to the person who has mild cognitive impairment with memory loss. You can see the shrinkage, and you can see the shrinkage in moderate Alzheimer's disease. And what's important here, right over here and here, are what we call the hippocampi. This is the memory switchboard of your brain, right here. Sits underneath your ears. And lo and behold, even with the general loss here of brain volume, look here, look at the spaces that are beginning to appear as the hippocampus shrinks. As your hippocampus shrinks, your memory shrinks. So we've been using these tools for quite some time to try to diagnose preclinical Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment, and now we're using these tools more carefully to see who's at risk. And that's very important. But this only gives us a gross picture of what's going on in the brain. But remember this slide, okay? Hippocampal shrinkage, we've long thought is a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease, and only Alzheimer's disease. Okay? There we go. As we identified these abnormal proteins, the brain amyloid, new techniques came along that allow us to show buildup of amyloid. So here's a normal 70-year-old brain, doesn't light up because there's not a lot of that bad protein there. And lo and behold, here in an Alzheimer's brain, all those red areas that you see here in yellow, that's buildup of those amyloid proteins. And these amyloid proteins are neurotoxic. They're toxic to nerve cells. And in fact, when they're just little bits of these proteins, and I'll go into that in a little bit because it's important for clinical trials, those little bits of this abnormal protein actually will stick to the nerve cells and block signals. The best way to conceptualize this is that there's lots behind the disease. People believe that there are risk factors in midlife, like hypertension, unhealthy diet high in saturated fats. In fact, there's a lot of interest in the MIND diet or Mediterranean diet to reduce risk. Diabetes has been suggested as linked to Alzheimer's, but that jury is still out. In fact, some people call diabetes type 3 Alzheimer's. On the other hand, at our center, we study autopsy tissue and find that diabetes leads to cerebrovascular disease, a breakdown of the small blood vessels in the brain. Hence, neuronal damage and vascular insults. So all of these, if you will, bad habits lead to obesity, high blood pressure, elevated cholesterol levels, and you combine it with genetic risks, apolipoprotein E being the biggest one. It increases your risk by 4 to 8 times, depending on how many pairs of these genes you have. It's involved in cholesterol transport in the brain, and I won't spend a lot of time on the genetic aspects, but just to mention it. And all of these things add up over time to lead to Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. Some people believe that it's protective to become more educated, and there was a paper that just came out from my colleagues at Rush University suggesting that education really doesn't does not protect you. But I like to think it does. God knows I put enough time in. Physical activity, lots and lots of studies. In fact, some of the best clinical studies right now are involved in physical activity and exercise. Exercise helps the brain. Cognitive and social activity. Stay active mentally, stay active socially. This is tough for me, that second part. I'm active cognitively because I'm teaching all the time, I'm giving talks, I'm seeing patients. But boy, at the end of the day, I'm about the most grumpy guy in the world. So I'm kind of known in my department as the curmudgeon after about 6 o'clock at night. And interestingly enough, there is this concept of brain reserve. All of these protective factors strengthen your brain, we think. We can't prove it yet, but makes you more resistant to the Alzheimer's changes. So let me do something that I normally don't do, but let me go to the National Institute on Health, the National Institute on Aging. I recommend their website if you want detailed information about anything I talk about today. But let me show you what we've learned over the last 50 years of Alzheimer's research through this video, if you would please.
In healthy people, all sensations, movements, thoughts, memories, and feelings are the result of signals that pass through billions of nerve cells or neurons in the brain. Neurons constantly communicate with each other through electrical charges that travel down axons, causing the release of chemicals across tiny gaps to neighboring neurons. Other cells in the brain, such as astrocytes and microglia, clear away debris and help keep neurons healthy. In a person with Alzheimer's disease, the most basic form of dementia, toxic changes in the brain destroy this healthy balance. These changes may occur years, even decades, before the first signs of dementia. Researchers believe that this process involves two proteins called beta amyloid and tau, which somehow become toxic to the brain. It appears that abnormal tau accumulates, eventually forming tangles inside neurons. And beta amyloid clumps into plaques, which slowly build up between neurons. As the level of amyloid reaches a tipping point, there is a rapid spread of tau throughout the brain. But tau and beta amyloid may not be the only factors involved in Alzheimer's. Other changes that affect the brain may also play a role over time. The vascular system may fail to deliver sufficient blood and nutrients to the brain. The brain may lack the glucose needed to power its activity. Chronic inflammation sets in as microglial cells fail to clear away debris, and astrocytes react to distressed microglia. Eventually, neurons lose their ability to communicate. As neurons die, the brain shrinks, beginning in the hippocampus, a part of the brain important to learning and memory. People may begin to experience memory loss, impaired decision-making, and language problems. As more neurons die throughout the brain, a person with Alzheimer's gradually loses the ability to think, remember, make decisions, and function independently. Achieving a deeper understanding of the molecular and cellular mechanisms and how they may interact is vital to the development of effective therapies. Much progress has been made in identifying various underlying factors. Advances in brain imaging allow us to see the course of plaques and tangles in the living brain. Blood and fluid biomarkers are providing insights about when the disease starts and how it progresses. More is also known about the genetic underpinnings of the disease and how they can affect particular biological pathways. These advances enable the development and testing of promising new therapies, including drugs that reduce or clear the increase of tau and amyloid proteins in the brain, therapies targeting the vascular system, glucose metabolism, and inflammation, and lifestyle interventions like exercise or diet. and behavioral approaches like social engagement that may enhance brain health. Research is moving quickly, ever closer to the day when we can delay or even prevent the devastation of dementia.
So, a nice 5-minute clip that brings you up to date on what we've just covered in our slides. And we'll go back to our slides now. So, when I started my fellowship at Duke to study aging and Alzheimer's, that was in 1981. And nobody at that time would have predicted the advances we've made in the clinical and research aspects of this disease. And I'm going to bring you up to date on several of those. But one of the first findings in 1984 was that this little group of cells right here, the nucleus specialis of minor, was dying off. Notice here's that hippocampus again. It's right next to the hippocampus. And interestingly, this bundle of nerve cells reaches out into the brain, and it goes into our thinking and logic and decision-making centers in the front of the brain. It goes into our language centers and our eye-hand coordination centers, and it goes into the memory center. And it was discovered that these cells are remarkable nerve cells in that they use a chemical transmitter called acetylcholine. And acetylcholine was one of our first attempts at treating Alzheimer's disease. Try to boost the chemistry surrounding this memory signal, this neurotransmitter. And lo and behold, after some work, we had some successes. So some of the current symptomatic therapies that you all know are here. Cognex, not used much because it really was very toxic to the liver. Many people know about Aricept or Donepezil, followed by Exelon, followed by Reminil or Galantamine. All three of these affect the memory signal. They boost the memory signal by blocking its breakdown. So you get some relief. In fact, college students like to take it around exam time if they can get their hands on it. It boosts their memory a little bit. Then, roughly turn of the century, a new drug came out that acts differently than these four, and this affects toxicity in the nerve cell. It blocks the toxic signals, but it only seems to work in more advanced Alzheimer's disease. So these are our current symptomatic therapies. Not much progress when you look at this date. But the field around this time, actually in 1999, so right about here, got excited about the beta amyloid protein. And it got excited about the tau protein, as we learned. Now the tau protein, I'll talk about later, but I wanted to show you a picture that shows what you saw in the little video clip, that tau is a building block and an important stabilizer inside the nerve cell. And when tau appears in the brain and starts to clump inside the nerve cell, that's when the nerve cell is showing signs of that it's dying. Now, the excitement in the field in the 1990s, late 1990s, was about this amyloid beta protein or peptide. And we began to study it more carefully, and we found that this amyloid precursor protein right here is a very common protein in the body and brain. And lo and behold, we discovered that there are enzymes, beta secretase for one, and then gamma secretase for another, that cut this original protein into pieces so that the brain can use it. The brain and the body can use these proteins. But what happens is when you have a beta secretase cut and then a gamma secretase cut, right here you get the toxic protein. If it's just this, you don't get the toxic proteins. And these proteins build up, and as you saw in the video, they clump together. But in the meantime, you saw that little picture of the synapse, that little gap where the signal was. These little bits and pieces, before they get into the big clumps, can actually get into the synapse and cause it to misfire Why is this important? Well, this got the field. So here we have PET scans that can measure this protein, and maybe we can go after it. We discover that there's misfolded proteins in the brain, tau being one, that leads to different diseases, mostly Alzheimer's disease, and this is a cartoon showing the different ways that tau sticks to itself when it shouldn't. It abnormally clumps. Think of, has anybody ever gotten super glue on their fingers? And it sticks, and you're like, I can't. That's exactly what's happening to these proteins. They're sticking together. And in so doing, they're not doing their job. And here's the A-beta picture that leads to the original A-beta bits and pieces that I showed you. They start to stick together, and they stick together more, and they build up as these plaques in the brain causing problems. So at the time, we had these PET scans that could look at this. And interestingly, Dr. Schenk, in 1999, we developed mouse models of Alzheimer's disease. We used human genes, put them into mice, made the mice get Alzheimer's, or Mouseheimers if you like. And these genetic mice, as they got older, they basically showed the brain changes and the thinking changes that we see in Alzheimer's disease. So a 13-month-old mouse is like a 70-year-old human. But if he immunized these mice against this protein, this amyloid beta protein, they developed antibodies, and guess what? They enjoyed old age. So the thought was, if we can do this in mice, if we can cure Mouseheimers, even though we induced Alzheimer's, we induced Mouseheimers, we cure Mouseheimers, let's get it to people. So everybody got excited to try these vaccine studies. And the field has been trying multiple ways to stop this beta amyloid buildup and toxicity in different ways. We try to block the enzymes, we try to vaccinate against it, and has anybody heard of a success yet? No. Dozens and dozens and dozens of studies, and we've not gotten there yet. And the very first study taught us an important lesson, just like Cognex, when we developed the medicines to affect acetylcholine, led to toxicity for many people. What happened was, even though we pulled the beta amyloid out of the brain in humans, we saw a reduction in those beta amyloid levels. They didn't get much better. And there were some people who got better, some who didn't, and some who developed these dramatic changes in the brain where, if you will, think of the brain as having a bunch of wires in it. Think of it as like extension cords. And the myelin, or the insulation, excuse me, of these nerve cells was affected. And people got even sicker. So for some people, treating the beta amyloid led to dramatic brain illnesses, even though they had Alzheimer's. So the field said, well, let's build a better vaccine. Let's build a better drug. And we've not been very successful yet in Alzheimer's. So, being scientists and wanting to get research dollars, we said, well, we know from our brain scans, beta amyloid starts to build up in people in their 50s and 60s. Let's start earlier. So we can draw spinal fluid, we can do PET scans, and if you're positive for beta amyloid, we'll put you on therapy. And those studies...
If science teaches us anything, it teaches us to accept our failures as well as our successes with quiet dignity and grace.
You know, Gene Wilder shares my first name in this movie, Frederick. That's if you mispronounce my first name, Frederick. I don't quite have the hair, by the way, and I'm losing what I have, but it's nice to see. So here we are, study after study after study, we're not successful. So instead of accepting that failure with quiet dignity and grace. No, we're going to go earlier and see what happens. And those studies are ongoing. And we hope, every time we start a study, we hope that it's going to make a difference, that it's the answer. Now, if you're out there, if you have family with Alzheimer's, if you know someone with Alzheimer's, where can you go? Back in the 80s and 90s, without the internet, it was word of mouth. It's taking groups like the Alzheimer's Foundation of America to get the word out, to do the training, to get people more knowledgeable, to do outreach. But the National Institute on Aging and what's known as the ADIR Center, the Alzheimer's Disease Education and Referral Center, highlights ongoing clinical trials. And you can see here, anti-amyloid treatment's a big one. Uh-oh, exercise. Uh-oh, cognitive and mental health, keep your brain healthy. Nasal insulin to fight Alzheimer's. These are studies that are ongoing, and results should be soon available. So you can always go to the ADIR website and get updated. These are just a few examples of studies that have been ongoing, because many of these studies take 4, 5, 6, 10 years to get results, because you're starting early. Other studies that are currently ongoing, and I use these only as examples because there are dozens and dozens of studies. And you can go also to clinicaltrials.gov, clinicaltrials.gov website, and get a listing of current studies in your area if you have someone. But here we have a study of a gamma secretase modulator. In other words, we're going to change how gamma secretase slices that protein and hopefully prevent this A-beta buildup. We have another A-beta type protein that's going to block it from sticking to the nerve cell. Interestingly, in St. Louis and Washington University, they're studying an antidepressant because this antidepressant appears to reduce this deposition of the A-beta protein. Wouldn't it be cool if you could prevent Alzheimer's by taking an antidepressant? That would be really neat, and they're working on that. And that's based on the fact that they gave this antidepressant to these mice who were going to get Alzheimer's, and the mice didn't get it as quickly. In Pittsburgh, they're taking an old drug called lithium. People should be familiar with lithium because it was a frontline treatment for manic depressive disorder. But lithium affects the tau protein buildup. So lithium, even though it can be very toxic, if controlled and carefully monitored, might be a prevention. And then there's the genetic study that's being done at Manor Health in Arizona, where they're bringing people from South America who have genetic mutations, these presenilin mutations that guarantee if you have this mutation, you're going to get Alzheimer's at a young age. They're bringing them to Arizona and are studying the biology and giving them an anti-amyloid drug, this crenezumab, if you will, crenezumab, to see if it can block amyloid buildup in these people whose genetics will give them Alzheimer's. So these are just examples of trials. As I said, there are many trials. The good news is Vanderbilt has plenty of trials. They have a nice setup there, the Memory and Cognition Group. I highly recommend you use them as a local resource. I used to have a clinic at Vanderbilt. I would drive down from Lexington once every 4 months and spend a day here at Vanderbilt, and then I spend a day at Meharry, and we tried to set up clinical trials. And it's nice to see that the group is going well and growing. I'd like to believe that I made that happen, but I know better. Now, why have amyloid trials failed so far? Well, part of it is remember, this is 20 years ago, we go chasing this amyloid protein. In the process, we've discovered some important things by using these fancy PET scans that show us where amyloid is. And one of it is based on what my colleagues at Mayo Clinic Rochester have discovered, is that there are a bunch of people who don't have amyloid. 20 to 30% don't have this amyloid pathology. They're negative for this protein, but yet they have symptoms clinically that look like Alzheimer's disease. Here you can see the buildup of amyloid starting at age 40 and builds and builds and builds. So by doing these studies and these clinical trials, we've learned that there's some people who don't have those protein changes. So if you get diagnosed with SNAP, you have suspected non-amyloid pathology. In other words, something else is going on in your brain. And this has led to a lot of research interest. It's also told us that the brain is very complicated. I used this slide 2 years ago as my intro slide, and somebody pointed out that that doesn't look like me, but I claim it's a younger person, and go ahead and try to figure that one out. But that's a nerd outfit, right? White shirt, tie, I mean, come on. But this is how I looked at Alzheimer's disease when I was young and in training. We didn't know much about the disease. But just to bring in how complicated it is, and I always argue with my colleagues in internal medicine, in the heart center, in the diabetes center, that all of their stuff, everything they do, is important to the brain. Because everything they do, in terms of treating illnesses from the neck down, as you heard earlier, get a checkup from the neck up. If everything downstream, down below the neck, isn't working, then everything above the neck isn't working either. And let me give you a good example again of that one.
Hearts and kidneys are tinker toys. I'm talking about the central nervous system.
So when I talk to the medical students, I show that. And they go, you crazy neurology people, right? But all of the evidence suggests that those risk factors, cardiovascular disease, vascular disease, as you saw in the other video, diabetes, all of these things can promote the development of these abnormal proteins in the brain that lead to Alzheimer's. But research is showing us something more. And what it's showing us is there are other brain diseases that look like Alzheimer's. So here we are treating what we think is Alzheimer's disease in clinical trials, and we're not having much success. Some people do respond to our therapies. Some people do get better. Even with those studies with drugs like Aricept and Exelon and Memantine or Namenda, some people got better, some dramatically so. In fact, one of my patients in the Namenda study was both on Aricept and Namenda, and she stayed out of the nursing home and lived independently for 2 years. She had a dramatic response. And once these studies are done, scientists go back and try to parse out who got better and why. Instead of saying who got into the study, we're looking at clinical Alzheimer's disease. And so a lot of studies now are looking at brain scan markers of Alzheimer's disease. So you don't have SNAP. If you have SNAP, you shouldn't get into an amyloid study because you don't have amyloid in your brain. But if it looks like Alzheimer's disease, in other words, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, talks like a duck, it's a duck, or maybe it's a goose. And that's what we're seeing now as research has progressed. We're seeing that there are other brain diseases. And not many people know about these. Word hasn't gotten out. They look like Alzheimer's. They lead to changes that are similar to Alzheimer's, both functional and in terms of memory and thinking. And you provide the same care. The problem is that these people, because they look like Alzheimer's, get into a clinical study and may not benefit. And I'm going to talk about two of these. The video mentioned cerebrovascular disease, and I won't talk about a Parkinson's-like condition called dementia with Lewy bodies because we're very, very bad at diagnosing it right now. and there are not a lot of clinical trials. So, one of the things we've learned, and this is where that tau protein comes in, is there's a disorder we call PART. Okay, progressive age-related tauopathy. And one of the things we discovered at the University of Kentucky and other places, I'm just citing some of my own work and my colleagues, is that this buildup of tau can occur without a lot of beta amyloid. So it's not really Alzheimer's. But guess what? It starts to look like early Alzheimer's because it affects memory. And people who often come into clinic who say, you know, my memory's not really good, and they come in year after year, you know, it hasn't gotten better, it hasn't gotten worse. They probably have a buildup of tau in their brain for other reasons than the typical Alzheimer's combination of proteins. But some people will have this progressive age-related tauopathy, develop the beta amyloid, and it sure looks like Alzheimer's. But this is an important finding that has recently come out of studying the brain under the microscope. More importantly, you remember those pictures before where I showed you the hippocampus shrinking? You saw in the video, the hippocampus is shrinking. You saw in the connections, it's the hippocampus that's important. Well, guess what? For years, we would get a brain scan, we'd look at the hippocampus, and the hippocampus was shrunk, and we'd say it's Alzheimer's disease. Not anymore. We've discovered there's a whole nother animal called hippocampal sclerosis of aging. It's not Alzheimer's disease. It involves a different protein, and it affects particularly the memory center. Clinically, when I got into the business, we would call this the slow form of Alzheimer's. These people had memory loss, and therefore they couldn't function, but their language pretty much stayed okay, their eye-hand coordination stayed okay, their decision-making wasn't too bad if they could remember. So we call it the slow form of Alzheimer's. It hits people in their mid-80s and 90s. And we think, based on our studies of brain tissue, that that's related to breakdown of the small vessels in the brain. But we've identified the protein that's the culprit here. And so we have a new protein to worry about and to target for treatment. Now, this slide summarizes all of what we know looking at the brain. Now, hippocampal sclerosis of aging has another name called CARTS, C-A-R-T-S, and that is cerebral cerebral age-related TDP-43 with sclerosis. Get that one out. Yeah. So CARTS is another term you'll hear. But what's happening here? Here's the run-of-the-mill Alzheimer's picture. This is what we used to think. The older you get, the more likely it is that it's Alzheimer's. Okay? And Alzheimer's was the most common dementia. It still is. But as we get older, there are new brain conditions that have been identified that makes finding treatments even more of a struggle. But it's important because this mix of other diseases that mimic Alzheimer's are going to force us to develop alternate therapies. But look here, Alzheimer's is still the biggest group. Here's that progressive age-related tauopathy. Here's hippocampal sclerosis of aging, or CARTS. Here are the synucleinopathies that you see. That's a different protein that builds up in Parkinson's and Lewy body disease. Stroke, big interest now in stroke. And arteriolosclerosis, in other words, blockages of the vessels in the brain. So these add up to all of the dementias, and the older you get, the more the odds increase. But this is part of the reason that maybe some of these Alzheimer's trials have not been as successful. Because how do we know that these diseases exist? We're doing it after the person passes away. We're putting it under the microscope. I've tried to get my hair to look like this when I go in to teach. I've been unsuccessful. It has an air of wisdom, you know, the mad scientist kind of thing. And I am no Einstein, trust me. It takes a lot of hard work to understand a very broad field. So I encourage you to go look at other websites, particularly the Alzheimer's disease and referral website. It's very useful. The AFA website also is very useful. Now, I spend a lot of my time doing research, and so I thought I'd add something. This is not in your handout. I apologize. But I need to give you a little bit of hope. After scaring the dickens out of you, at least I was, to discover that what I was treating as Alzheimer's disease wasn't always Alzheimer's disease, much less try to find something that would treat Alzheimer's disease. There's been a lot of work on identifying blood tests for Alzheimer's disease. So to get a PET scan to see if you have amyloid in your brain, that ligand, what they have to inject to get into your brain and then light up, stick to the amyloid and light up the scanner, that takes about $3,000 for the injection, and then about $2,000 for the PET scan. And lo and behold, we now have something that will tag tau in the brain. So there's another $6,000 worth to get 2 PET scans, put a bunch of radiation in your brain to see if you have Alzheimer's. Is there a better way? Well, spinal fluid can tell us. Much cheaper, much more sensible. People are afraid of it, I understand. And our center, and we've shared this with the National Institute on Aging, we have one of our neurologists actually letting one of the medical students do a lumbar puncture or spinal tap on it, and you'll be surprised. Has anybody ever had lumbar puncture for any reason here? Yeah. The headache is the big concern, post-LP headache, but if it's done right with a good needle, less than 1% of people develop the headache. So this has been an area of research to get the spinal fluid, because we can analyze the spinal fluid. What's happening? As the A beta builds up in the brain, the A beta goes down in the spinal fluid. As the tau fills the brain, it gets into the spinal fluid, so A beta goes down, tau goes up, and we can do a better job of diagnosing it in a much simpler fashion. But even more exciting are the research groups, and this one is the University of California, Irvine, that have been working on a blood test. And there are lots of groups working on blood tests. But this is what's exciting about this work. This group has found 12 different indicators in a blood test that seems to separate people with Alzheimer's disease from those who have normal memory. And not only that, so here's Alzheimer's, early Alzheimer's on this blood test. This is their memory. This is their index off of this blood test. Note there's some people that it doesn't identify. Who knows what's going on there? But here's the normal folks. They look about the same in memory. This index that they derive does separate these groups to some extent. Again, there's a little noise here. But they also have identified people whose memory is super good. So it could be that in the next few years, we'll be seeing more and more blood-derived panels that can help us determine which brain disorder a person has. Now, the other great message here is that you could be up here in the blue zone. You could be a supernormal when it comes to memory and thinking. I don't know who these supernormals are, because we'd have to test your memory to figure that out. But the very fact that we can start looking at these components, all the things that we talked about before affecting the brain, oxidative stress, which causes the clumping, the inflammation, so the microglia and the glia not doing their cleanup job at night, and nitric oxide, which is important for vascular health and antioxidant activity, are also implicated. So we're trying to see what's happening in this thick skull of mine by drawing a little bit of blood and determining, based on my memory test, along with my blood index, where would I fall? This is interesting. Now, I mentioned this, the inflammation, the oxidative stress, the A beta buildup. There's other research that I'll mention. I didn't include a slide, but this is important. Get a good night's sleep. There's new evidence suggesting that your brain's ability to clean out the gunk, get those A beta fragments, these protein fragments, out into the bloodstream, away from your nerve cells in the brain, away from your neurons, happens during sleep. Your brain clears this out. And interestingly, if you have disrupted sleep, and if you snore, you wake up with a headache, you have hypertension, you're a guy, you're at more greater risk for what's known as sleep apnea syndrome. That puts pressure on your heart and your brain through the blood vessels. Get treated. There's evidence that suggests that your risk for Alzheimer's goes way up if you have untreated sleep disorders, particularly sleep-disordered breathing. There's a study, it's now about 5 years old, out of Dr. Ankoli Israel's group, showing that women with obstructive sleep apnea, untreated sleep-disordered breathing, and it's easy to treat, have 8 times the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease compared to women who don't. So sleep is important. We don't understand all of this yet, but it's treatable. So if your partner says you snore too much, you gasp in your sleep, your breathing stops, you've kicked your husband or wife into the other bedroom because they do these things, get checked out. Your primary care doc can do it. In the old days, you'd have to spend 2 nights in the hospital. Now they even have home testing with these new computer systems. Get checked. Also, and this is important for people of non-Caucasian backgrounds. African Americans and Hispanic Americans or Latinos have twice the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease compared to Caucasians. Why? We have ideas, but we don't know. Is this due to health disparities? In other words, more African Americans have hypertension, more African Americans have diabetes, and so on. So there's a national group called the Balm and Gilead, and ourselves. That's my office right there. Right there. Yeah. If you ever come down, you see that building, just throw a rock through that window. I'll know you're here. That's assuming I'm in the office. I might be in clinic. We've tried to increase outreach, and the folks here at Vanderbilt are doing the same thing. And AFA has sponsored a similar project in Atlanta with Dr. Monica Parker at Emory to reach out to the African American community in particular and use the power of the pulpit, as we call it, on Sundays to get that message out. Increase your health awareness. Know your numbers. And you'll maybe see some local PR for Memory Sunday, which is coming up June 9th of this year. And if you're interested, we, along with the Balm and Gilead, developed this book for ministers. And even though it's for African American congregations, if you download it and you like it, it can be modified. It's free. Give it to your own minister or pastor or priest, and they can add it to their sermons. One other thing, last time I did this talk, it was called the National Educating America Tour. I can't resist the acronym, NEAT, because it's really neat what AFA does. It's really neat what the medical research community has done in the past 40, 50 years of research with Alzheimer's. I hope that you take away with you today some concepts. We're working hard to find treatments. We're working hard to find a cure. There are genetic risks. There are lifestyle risks. And because of research, we've discovered that what we think is Alzheimer's in the clinic is not always Alzheimer's under the microscope, which means that we're going to have to work extra hard to find treatments for those people as they get older. In fact, the National Institute of Neurologic Disorders and Stroke just started a big project about 2 years ago and just asked for more research into what's known as vascular dementia. And a recent call for research is what's known as post-stroke dementia. So there's an interest in developing ways of identifying those clinical problems and therefore looking at the biofluids, looking at markers out of the blood, out of the spinal fluid, on scans, to see if we can find what's going on after stroke with dementia, just like in Alzheimer's disease, so we can develop therapies. So there's a lot of work that's done. I like to say that when I joined the University of Kentucky, there was not a gray hair on my head, and that working there led to more gray hair. That wasn't enough. Now they're making it fall out. But I'll stop there, and I think we have time for questions. Is that correct? I did time it.
So we do have time. You also failed to tell them you were 6'6" before you started working at the university.
Well, that's due to my wife in the frying pan that I lost.
I didn't say that. But we have time for a few questions. And say hi to Amanda from AFA on my right and Jeannie on my left. They will pass the mic to you if you have any questions. Right there, Amanda.
Thank you. Welcome to Tennessee.
Thank you. I've been here before, you know.
Into Vanderbilt territory. Thank you.
Sure.
Also, can you touch on some of the research that's being done by Dr. Van Eldick at Sanders Brown about inflammation in the brain and developing medication?
Sure. So, Dr. Van Eldick is a relative newcomer to our research center at Sanders Brown Center on Aging. By the way, you know why it's Sanders Brown Center on Aging? The Colonel was involved in founding our research building. Now, mind you, because we know that diet is important, we don't hand out fried chicken. But we have a picture of the Colonel with then Governor John Y. Brown shaking hands as they did the ribbon cutting. But the center has been one of the leading research centers on the effect of both oxidative stress on the brain and inflammation on the brain. And about 8 years ago, Dr. Van Eldick joined us to take over leadership at the center and has worked hard on defining inflammation. Now, why is this important? Well, that inflammation affects the microglia, and it seems to affect how the brain clears out. You saw in that video, you know, these interesting cells are clearing out these abnormal proteins. But inflammation makes these cells attack each other, if you will. Keep it at that level. So Dr. Van Eldick's work is in identifying anti-inflammatory drugs that might help this disease. Now, you may have heard that we've already tried anti-inflammatory drugs. We've tried ibuprofen. It was observed years ago that people with arthritis who were taking anti-inflammatory drugs for their arthritis were less likely to get Alzheimer's disease. So, holy cow, let's give a bunch of people anti-inflammatory drugs. And there were big studies, except that they were stopped because the anti-inflammatory drugs, we did learn something, were affecting the heart, increased the risk of heart attack and so forth. So, remember Vioxx? Anybody remember the drug named Vioxx? That was one of the first to show that it was too dangerous to give. And then so companies and researchers came up with other molecules, other ways of getting similar drugs that would be less toxic. And Dr. Van Eldick's work has been towards this small molecule that penetrates the brain and can reduce inflammation. And those studies are currently underway. I think there's a clinical trial that's underway at Duke right now. She did her fellowship at Duke like I did. So I guess once you're a Dookie, you're always a Dookie, except it's easy to cross out the D and the E and just stay with the UK. So the whole point is if this small molecule can block the inflammation, reduce the response of the microglia, the brain can have a better environment to clear out the abnormal proteins. And this inflammation in the brain happens for a lot of neurologic disorders, happens in head trauma and so forth. So her work is really geared at, can we put out the fire, the inflammation in the brain? And if so, what benefit do we derive? Does that answer your question about inflammation? Sure.
Any other questions for Dr. Schmidt?
Have I worn everybody out?
We have a question over here.
Okay.
So I have read that Alzheimer's and dementia as a whole is much less in India, and the conjecture is that, or they have conjectured and attributed it to turmeric. Is there any validity to that thinking, and are there any studies being done? Also, I'd like to know your thoughts about the connection with metformin and the decreased incidence of dementia in people taking metformin.
Sure. So the reduced incidence that is seen in India for Alzheimer's disease, and in some other countries in what we would call this Pacific region, Southeast Asia and so forth, may be due to dietary ingestion of certain herbs over the lifespan that reduce inflammation. Turmeric being a good example. Curcumin is being studied right now. A medicinal grade of curcumin is being studied by the folks in California to see if it makes a difference. But the belief is it's not just the antioxidant herbs and spices, but also the nature of the diet. It's a lower fat diet, it's a healthier diet, more green leafy vegetables and fruits that go along with those spices that makes the difference. Now, the second question in terms of, repeat the question so I can reformulate it. Because that's a tough one. The metformin is a tough question.
We've heard that, or we've read recently that people taking metformin tend to have a lower incidence of dementia or Alzheimer's.
Perfect. Don't say Alzheimer's. Okay, metformin and Alzheimer's. Now there are studies looking at intranasal insulin to treat Alzheimer's. We just finished a study on gemfibrozil, which is an anti-diabetic drug like metformin, to see what it does to proteins in the body. But where is the metformin effect? The answer is, most people think that these anti-diabetic agents, like metformin, will reduce the risk of Alzheimer's. What our research shows, is that it reduces the risk of dementia, because if you have diabetes and you're taking metformin, the big risk is to your blood vessels. Not just your blood vessels, but your other organs due to brittleness of the blood vessels. But the brittleness of the blood vessels in the brain may be the key. So we released a study, it's now been 2 years ago, where we said, does diabetes lead to Alzheimer's? The answer, based on brain pathology, is if you have diabetes, it takes very little Alzheimer's change to lead to dementia. And so the metformin treatment seems to reduce that small vessel risk. So it reduces the risk for dementia due to small vessel disease, we think.
I was wondering if you could tell us what the difference is between Alzheimer's disease and dementia, because it seems like it's the same in certain areas.
Yeah, so the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Dementia is the broader term. So you can have dementia due to a number of diseases that affect the brain. So you think of, as I mentioned earlier, post-stroke dementia, dementia with Lewy bodies. We could say dementia of the Alzheimer type, but Alzheimer's is the most common dementia. So you think of dementia, and then there's a bunch of subcategories, with Alzheimer's being the biggest bunch. Think of that little, are we still live up there? Are we still queued up? I can back up. No?
1 second.
Nope. Sorry. Think of that little graph with the multiple colors.
Which slide do you want?
That's okay. That's okay. Think of the graph with the multiple colors, where each type of dementia was being listed on the right. They're all dementias, and they're all due to different protein effects on the brain. That's the way to think of it.
Okay. Can you differentiate between mild cognitive impairment and essential tremor? I know those are different, but how does that lead to Alzheimer's?
So very different animals that you just described. Simple tremor versus mild cognitive impairment. So mild cognitive impairment clinically means that you have a memory complaint. You yourself notice your memory's changing, or somebody in your family says they're not remembering as well. You do a memory test, and you don't do as well as you should. But your daily living skills are okay, and you have no trouble getting around and doing things except for the memory change. That's mild cognitive impairment, amnesia. Now, the tremor that you speak of can be due to multiple causes. It can be located diseases in the cerebellum, which is that lump at the bottom of your brain that controls motor function. It can be due to what we call vascular Parkinson's. So small strokes in the right area of the brain can lead to like a resting tremor or an intention tremor. So a resting tremor is what you see when the person's resting. Otherwise, they're like this, and they're reaching for something, and then the tremor kicks in. All of those have to do with the motor pathways of the brain. And this alpha-synuclein changes that you see in Parkinson's are another reason you might see tremor. So there's a lot of interest. We used to talk about this benign senescent tremor. You might see a relative whose head kind of tremors a little bit, or they have a little tremor there. The odds are that's cerebellar in nature. And there are some genetic risks, there are vascular risks. And interestingly enough, some evidence from Columbia University suggests that there's a buildup of tau in the cerebellum that's associated with it. So tau is a marker of neuronal injury. So what is injuring the neuron to turn that tau loose? That's a big question. So mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, memory complaint, memory loss, not enough to interfere with day-to-day skills. Excuse me. Tremor. I didn't take my Zyrtec. That's not an ad. I should say antihistamine. Tremor, different causes, different brain pathways.
So can you treat mild cognitive impairment with Alzheimer's therapy?
So people will try that. Yes. They will try to treat mild cognitive impairment with the same drugs for Alzheimer's.
We have time for one more question, if anybody has it. Right up here.
Would you care to offer any comments regarding Dr. Bredeson's protocol?
Oh, my old colleague, Dr. Bredesen, he was a resident at Duke while I was there. So, Dr. Bredeson's protocol. How do I describe it? Personalized medicine. Dr. Bredesen, he's out, I think he's still at the Buck Institute in San Francisco, has published on a number of patients that he has seen where he has looked at what might be behind their Alzheimer's disease. And he has looked into the research literature and come up with a cocktail, if you will, for these people. And the cocktail involves such things as diet, exercise, and different medicines that are approved, as well as different antioxidants. He might give curcumin, he might give vitamin E and vitamin C. So what he's doing is, he's taking all of the available evidence from these big clinical trials and trying to tailor to each individual a prescription to see if it will help. There's a lot of controversy about Dr. Bredesen's approach because everybody thinks in terms of a standard therapy, right? So if you have high blood pressure, you should be on an antihypertensive. What we forget is that there's dozens of antihypertensives. And if you may not respond to one, and you need a different one. And so they forget that. They think that there's a monolithic approach, whereas Dr. Bredesen says there's an art to medicine. Each person is unique, so this personalized medicine approach, where we can put together the right combination of nutrients, the right combination of supplements, the right combination of exercise and sleep and so forth, could make a difference. Again, he's published on this. It hasn't been taken out to a large-scale study, although the evidence for what he does is fairly strong from big studies like the finger studies, the Finnish study where they're modifying with exercise and diet and looking at how people's aging and memory changes. So there is evidence, but it's not very strong. So he runs into a lot of critiques. A lot of standard medical community folks say, that's snake oil. But he's basing it on what we've learned over the past 40 to 50 years to give each individual a shot at that. And if you're interested and you have a medical background, I think you can get trained out in San Francisco. I think the course costs $30,000, so you can take that to your patients. That is not an ad either. That's me being a cynic. But Dale and I have known each other for a long time, and he's a bright fellow, and when you're desperate, you'll do what needs to be done. I mean, in the early days, people went and got chelation therapy. In other words, think of renal dialysis. They would filter your blood in the hopes of treating Alzheimer's disease at $3,000 a session. So we've come a long way, and there's a lot that needs to be learned, I think. But his approach is unique.
Thank you for your questions. It's always been an honor for AFA to have Dr. Schmidt on our medical advisory board, and a privilege and to attend our conferences. He drove a mere 230 miles to be with us. Dr. Schmidt, thank you so much. So we're going to move ahead with the schedule. Before we do our program, we have some gifts that we have 3 giveaways today of donations to AFA. Julie Lovell, where are you? Right there. You are the recipient of our first prize from the Tennessee Titans. So I talked a little bit about the significance and importance of a memory test and memory screening. Say hi to Amanda. She's going to meet Julie. She's right there. Hi, Amanda. So, memory screenings. Nobody has signed up yet. Would anybody like to have a memory test? You signed up. Terrific. Good. Amanda will handle that. Over here to our left, Amanda. You signed up. She'll be happy to do that. We're going to show you a little brief film, a few-minute video about AFA. I don't know. Sam.
My last 8 years in the city, and for my brother's last 11 years in the city, we took Sam out to lunch once a month. So we had a routine. We'd meet him at the diner around the corner from his apartment. And the first time it was really dawned on us that there was an issue is when he didn't show up. We were scared, we were running around, and then we finally went and saw him in his apartment. He just forgot about it. And from then it was kind of like progressively a downward spiral. Then when we knew it was a major issue was when he was cooking and forgot to turn his stove off. And at that point it was, we have a real issue here. And we need to start looking for resources to help us navigate through this and figure out a solution for him. Sam was a young boy when the Holocaust broke out. He was living in Poland with his family. He was brought to 3 or 4 different death camps and was able to survive all of them.
Concentration camps, ghettos, living in the forces.
He's living a beautiful life. He's an inspiration to me every time I see him. It's really troubling when you're watching someone and they're losing their mental capabilities, and they're losing their memories, and they're losing who they are as a person. It strips everything that you built an entire life for and everything you became, and it turns you into someone that you're not. It's a debilitating disease that it's going to affect you, and it's going to change the person that you are, both mentally and physically. And it also has a great effect on your family members, because it's very difficult to watch someone that you love go through such a tough time. He's probably written his life story 35 times. I think it's because he doesn't want people to forget what he's been through. And it's just so ironic that as this disease has taken over his life, he's starting to forget his own memories. And so here it starts, and it's talking about him and his life, and then we're a third of the way through the book, and he starts over. And so he writes his name, and he was born on December 1st, 1922, and then it goes through his whole story once again. Told me he was scared. He knew he was starting to lose it, and his memory was starting to go. He was vocal to me and said, I need help, and I need to get out of my apartment, and I can't live by myself anymore. Dancing it's his pleasure. Dancing to music is what it makes him happy, it makes him tick. He used to be very active. He was always going to the senior centers in the city. He was around people, he was dancing, he was happy, he was loving life. So where Sam is now, he can't dance anymore. He hasn't been dancing for the last year. And the hope is when he moves into the facility, he'll be able to start dancing again. I'm having a network of people to tap into, the Alzheimer's Foundation. They introduced me to a group of nurses that have been able to take care of my uncle. For a man that's been able to, beat almost everything else, to know that this is one he ultimately isn't going to be able to beat, it's tough, but there's hope. There's hope for him to find a cure. There's hope to make the rest of his days on earth better. What I think will make his life more enjoyable is getting into an assisted living facility where they have the tools and resources to help people in this situation. No matter what hand you're dealt, it's really your attitude and the way that you go through life that's gonna, ultimately decide the way that you live your life. And as long as we keep on fighting, there's hope.
The story where one day Sam did not show up to have breakfast with him and his brother at a local diner. So Jared came to us, and we were able to put Sam in one of our member offices, the lot residence on the Upper West Side. And I have to tell you, his first year there, we'd love to say he put on the freshman 15, gained a few pounds, had a girlfriend, and was doing so well that one day I had gone to see him in recreational therapy, and he was throwing a beach ball around, and I have to tell you, I didn't recognize him. He was doing so well. But one day while he was having lunch, he noticed a woman across from him at the table wasn't eating. Put down his own fork and went around and was feeding her. Wonderful person. We lost Sam recently in his 90s, but the last 4 or 5 years, his quality of life improved significantly. because he was taken out of his isolation of his own residence and put into a setting where there was a socialization. But this is part of what we do, and it's we never lose sight of the fact that while we do fund research for a cure, a lot of our research from New York, throughout the country, as I said, as far as Israel, is for better treatment as well, and we never give up hope at AFA. In your packets there, you have evaluations. It's really important to us that after every speaker, you provide your comments. It helps us plan the next conference, and it helps us ensure that what you want to hear, we are delivering. To introduce our next speaker, please welcome Jean Turkheimer from AFA. Jean?
For our next session, I would like to introduce Barbara Boone McGinnis, an elder law attorney with the firm Takis McGinnis, right here in the Nashville area. Barbara is an emerging national leader in the elder care field. She provides legal experience on a wide range of client issues with a focus on life care planning, Medicaid appeals, veterans benefits, and probate matters. She is also a VA accredited attorney. Before participating in law, Barbara spent more than 20 years in the healthcare field as a nurse practitioner, working in a variety of settings, including hospitals, long-term care centers, outpatient clinics, and home health. Barbara is also one of the principals of Life Care Consulting, LLC, which helps attorneys launch successful life care planning practices. Barbara will provide tips for long-term care planning. She will review some of the types of benefits and care plans that are available. She will also discuss what you need to know about Medicaid and Medicare, veterans benefits, long-term care insurance, and other issues concerning paying for long-term care. Please join me in welcoming Barbara McGinnis.
Slides? Okay, well, let's see if it does. It does. Okay, so let's see if we can go backwards. No. Okay, we're going to stay right here. Thank you guys for having me. My name is Barbara McGinnis, and like she said, I spent 20 some odd years of my early part of my life as a RN and a nurse practitioner focusing on geriatric health care. I did work in a variety of settings, but most of that time was spent in long-term care here locally. I went back to school late in life and graduated with my JD when I was about 46 or so. And part of the reason that I did that was that my family had an experience with Alzheimer's disease. My dad. I'm an only child, and it was just me and my mom and my dad. And mom was dad's primary caregiver, so I was mom's primary care support giver. And as we were going through that journey, she took care of him every day. She did everything for him, right? Everything from cleaning up the melted ice cream in the refrigerator when he didn't put it back in the right place, and making sure he got his medicines. And but when it was time for placement, leaving the home and moving into a long-term care facility, she felt like that was a defeat. She felt defeated. I had to encourage that that was just the progression of care that he needed. And I was very involved in that placement decision. But for the next few years that he lived there, I could help her understand the trajectory of the illness, the medications that were administered. We decided some of the non-dementia healthcare decisions together, whether or not to continue to do ultrasounds to monitor an aortic aneurysm, those kind of things. But what she couldn't find anyone to help her with what I couldn't help her with was knowing what it was going to be like to pay privately for long-term care for an unknown period of time. Watching her be afraid of my dad living a long life because she was afraid of what that was going to do to them financially was really an impetus for law school. I could help older people navigate the healthcare system. I could help people understand their treatment plans. But as a nurse practitioner, I couldn't help them understand how care was going to get paid for. That's a lot of what elder care lawyers do, is help pull it all together. It's been a very meaningful life experience for me. As I've helped, I feel like I've helped a lot of families in this process. So, welcome today to getting your ducks in a row. That's what I call this presentation. Because a lot of times clients come to me and that's what they say. They want to get their ducks in a row. However, what most people don't know is they don't have ducks. They have squirrels. And squirrels are hard to get in a row. They're everywhere. It's a sad joke, right? But you get the idea. You get the idea of what we do. Sometimes what motivates people to come in to plan for their ducks and squirrels and everything else is a brush with long-term care. Or it's a fear of long-term care. What will it be like in the future? What will it be like for me? So, what is long-term care? We all may have some ideas of what long-term care is. Sometimes people just think it's living in the nursing home. That's what long-term care is. But long-term care may take place in a variety of settings. It certainly is not taking place in the hospital. The hospital is acute care. You visit it for a brief period of time, hopefully. It's not skilled nursing facility care or rehab care. That's also a temporary setting. You're there for a short period of time. Medicare gives you up to 100 days if you have a skilled service. What long-term care is for people who have physical or mental incapacity requiring ongoing assistance with activities of daily living. It's custodial care by and large, and it can take place in a variety of settings, including the home. Long-term care can take place in your home. It takes place in other community-based settings like assisted living facilities, and it also may take place in a nursing home. The scope of the need for long-term care is great, and it's growing every day because you can't pick up any article about the demographic shift in the United States without seeing that it is the older adult group that is our fastest growing section of our population, and in fact, it is the oldest of the old that is our fastest growing population, the 85 plus. Family support. Families are in transition. That is another big factor related to long-term care. You know, a lot of people say, my kids are going to take care of me. That's not a good plan. I don't know your family, but I can tell you in general, that's not a good plan. Families are in transition more than ever in America, even in our community here. For one thing, that baby boomer generation that's becoming the old people of our society, we tend to be single. I mean, we're more likely to be single than other demographic groups, right? Certainly more likely to be single than the generation that is currently 85 and 90 years old. Because one, yes, we may be widowed, but two, more likely to be divorced. Three, very likely that we never married. So we're likely to be single. We're also likely to not have kids, or not have as many kids. You know, our kids may not live near us. Our kids may work. So, and our kids may be estranged, not just from distance, but there's fractured families. So don't count on your kids taking care of you. That's not really a plan. So who's going to need long-term care? 60 to 70% of people turning 65 can expect to need some form of long-term care. And in that particular statistics, we are talking about nursing home care. The average length of time in a nursing facility, 3 years. Risk factors. These are a lot easier risk factors to comprehend than Dr. Schmidt talking about all the different risk factors for Alzheimer's. As you can imagine, women are more likely than men to need long-term care. Again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that we're more likely to be alone. We've outlived our spouse. And women are more likely to be the caregiver for their spouse. Disability, having chronic illness or a sudden disability related to trauma, may make us at risk for needing long-term care. Chronic conditions, the more comorbidities we have, the more likely we are going to have some sort of disability that impacts our activities of daily living. Poor diet, lack of exercise, and living alone all put us at risk of needing this custodial care in a long-term care facility. Our planning goals. Planning goals for people that come to see me and talk to me about what kind of goals they have for their future tend to revolve around 3 things. 1, quality of care. Whether it's a person coming in to talk about their own care or family members coming to talk about a loved one, they want to make sure that there is good care. They're worried they won't get good care in a long-term care facility. Decision making. Who is going to be my surrogate decision maker if I become incapacitated? And the children that are very often named that surrogate decision maker, how do I make good decisions? How do I do the right thing? You know, baby boomers also love to stay in control. We expect to stay in control of ourselves and our care and our money and our life, and we don't like the idea of giving that control away. The third thing, but it's always one of the things, is asset protection. How do we use our own money wisely? How do we not pay more for care than what we need to pay for care? How do we use and access benefits that might be available to us through government programs? Government programs like using Medicare correctly, using Medicaid if that becomes appropriate, veterans benefits, and there's other support system type programs in the local communities. They all have these common goals. So real quick, when we talk about the continuum of care and the settings for custodial care, the big block, the big puzzle piece there is home care, because the majority of custodial care is taking place in the home. It's where people want to live as long as possible. It's also the site where a lot of care is unpaid for. There's millions and millions of dollars worth of care that's provided in the home setting from family and friends that support people and allow them to live at home for a longer period of time. It has untold costs, reduced earnings for those caregivers, impacting Social Security and net savings. Other ways of care being paid for in the home, like a home health provider that comes in, may be paid for through Medicare. It is a Medicare benefit. Long-term care insurance. And by the way, if you do not have long-term care insurance, the 50-year-old age group, that's a really good time to start looking for that product. You're going to find it's more affordable. There are other products that will underwrite you through your 70s, and there are hybrid plans that will include a long-term care rider on a life insurance policy, right? Long-term care insurance, what's the biggest stated barrier for people getting long-term care insurance? You're afraid you're not going to use it, right? So why buy insurance I'm not going to use? Hence, the hybrid policies are really popular because everyone can be assured of the fact that they will die one day. Glad somebody saw the humor in that, yeah. So, care at home, unpaid gets provided either through unpaid caregivers, Medicare-covered home health, long-term care insurance. VA has a program to support veterans at home. So a lot of care is happening at home. Adult daycare is a great program, but it's a small little piece of the puzzle because it is not widely available. And certainly more available in urban settings than in rural settings. There are small centers of care for the most part with waiting lists, and it's also very cost affordable. So it's a great program when you can find it. Assisted living in and around Davidson County area, if I had to give you a number, I would tell you that it's going to average around $5,000 a month. You can find it less costly, you can find it more costly. It is very amenity driven. And nursing home care is going to, again, in and around Davidson County, we're at the $7,000 a month sort of average range. So that is the continuum of care. You can see why people want to stay at home as long as possible. No mystery about that. Custodial care is not really going to be defined by the setting as much as the services. But when we get to that place at the end of the continuum, the nursing home, we worry, can we get good care there? Where's a place to get good care, and how do I know that I'm getting good care? Yes, it is possible to get good care in these facilities. It is not going to be as customized, person-centered as care at home is going to be, but sometimes you outgrow what can be provided at home. Nursing home facility-based care, you need to research those facilities in your local community. Start researching them before you need them so you will know what to expect. Don't just judge the facility by the appearance. The brand new building that's built, in a large parcel of property, it may be beautiful, it may not be cost affordable, and the care may not be any better than at some of the older facilities in town. So do your research by visiting. Check out compare sites like the Medicare.gov compare sites. Ask your physician, ask your home health nurse, ask your elder law attorney, ask the folks that go to your support group. What kind of experiences have they had at different facilities? And then a good rule of thumb, and proximity is going to make the difference. Proximity to you as a caregiver. If you're the spouse of someone that's needing long-term care, a facility that's close to you so that you can visit on a frequent basis, because it is an important ongoing part of ensuring good care is family involvement or advocate involvement. So connecting the goals. Can I have all of my goals be met? And through proper planning, I would say yes, it is possible that you can bring your goals together of getting high quality care and protecting assets. And the role of the elder law attorney in this process is to help ensure that you can put together a plan, you can control your plan, and that we can together make sure that you get good care and can protect your assets to at least some extent. And I would say that what's the likelihood of this happening is the earlier you plan, the more options you may have. Putting it off until the day you actually find yourself or your loved one in a nursing home, your options are going to be fairly limited at that point in time. But it is never too late to plan for something to put yourself in some better position. Okay, now we're actually going to start talking about what legal documents. What kind of legal documents should be an essential part of your affairs? You know, elder law attorneys cannot talk about these documents in the absence of thinking about the healthcare system that you're going to need to use these documents. Advanced directives, that's a generic term, right? It's a big umbrella for some other documents that you may encounter. It certainly is going to include a durable power of attorney, a healthcare power of attorney, maybe an advanced care plan, and maybe even a post form. And a post form, if you don't know, is a physician order for scope of treatment. It's actually the set of physician's orders that, because care providers, whether it's EMS people or the folks in the assisted living facility, they can't see your advanced directive and turn it into an action plan the way a physician can. So a physician turns a conversation with you and your documents of healthcare powers of attorney, your advanced care plan, into a set of orders for these care providers to actually follow. Maybe the most important document that you can execute is a durable power of attorney. It is the basic long-term care planning tool. It can be comprehensive or it can be limited. I would encourage that decision to be based off of a conversation with your attorney. But you know, we use limited powers of attorney when we're buying or selling a house or selling a car. To take care of your life, you probably want something that's fairly comprehensive. It can include medical decision making. So there are some documents and some practitioners that actually write all that together in one document. The durable general as well as the healthcare provisions in one document. We do not. And here's the insurance part, the part that makes you insured against having your decisions decided upon by a judge in a court, is that if you plan ahead and you name an agent, that you can avoid court proceedings. That sounds intriguing, doesn't it? Going to court to have your everyday life decided upon sounds impractical and, I don't know, it sounds very violating and open, doesn't it? So, who in here, I'm kind of getting used to the lights, who in here actually has a power of attorney document? Like, you've executed a power of attorney document. Okay. I see a lot of hands. Of those hands, keep them up. Do you know where it is? Could you put your hand on it when you got home today? Okay. Does your agent know where that document is? Oh yeah. So, thank you. That's it. But that's really the biggest. You know, only about 50% of us, on average, you know, like if we poll the whole city, about 90+% of everybody knows they need to have a power of attorney. About, I don't know, 30 to 40% of us tend to have one. Over age 65, it gets as high as about 50% of us have a power of attorney in place. But that number drops dramatically when we add, do you know where it is? And does your agent know where it is? And that's really important. You think that's kind of important, right? If you want somebody to act for you and that piece of paper is giving them authority, you need to be able to find that. So, how many other people have that safe place to store things and then you forget where your safe place was? It's not necessarily a safe deposit box at the bank either, because your bank tends to be closed on weekends and holidays, and an awful lot of emergencies and accidents and events occur on those days. So that's not a great place to store your document. Decision-making authority for you should be given to someone else. So this is your control over who's going to make decisions for you and saying when they're going to make decisions for you. And when you name that person, it's not necessarily in birth order. It can be whomever you trust, that's available, that's willing to advocate, and that list could go on, right? So they need to be close by, at least to be aware that you need them, willing to advocate, trustworthy, probably need to be pretty good about making financial decisions. Okay, so when you're drafting considerations, when we're working on creating this document for you, there's a few considerations to be taken into place, right? It can be effective immediately. Now, if you sign a power of attorney that is effective immediately, you have not given any of your rights or any of your control away. Because that's one of the key differences between between a power of attorney and a conservatorship. In a power of attorney, someone is not in control of you. You are in control of you. But you name a person to help make decisions or to make decisions in your stead. A conservatorship, your rights as a citizen, as a person, are actually removed from you and placed in another. So an effective, immediate power of attorney can be a good thing. It can also be springing, which is a contingent, or it's contingent upon some future event, usually contingent upon incapacity or impaired decision-making, as evidenced by and documented by your attending physician and probably another doctor. Extraordinary powers versus ordinary powers. Statute defines what is ordinary powers. Powers like paying your bills, paying your taxes, selling your real estate. Some of those things are ordinary powers. Extraordinary powers that come into place sometimes when you're in this special season of life that we're dealing with healthcare. An example of extraordinary powers would be the ability to make gifts. Well, if you are your spouse's agent, the decision maker, wouldn't you want your spouse to still be able to make a gift to your children, a gift to him or herself? So gifting powers needs to be taken into consideration, and that gifting power does not necessarily, or should it be limited to the annual gift amount that the IRS sets for you, because you may be in a situation where gifting beyond $15,000 a year is relevant for you. Backup plan. What I mean by backup plan is you've named your agent, maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's a sibling, but whatever, you've named your primary agent. But what if something happens to your agent? You need a backup plan. Like, for example, my husband is my named power of attorney. We travel a lot together. He's not a great driver. So we have a backup plan. And I think everyone should. If you have multiple children, and we do, you don't name them all, or at least not all together. It's a very unique family that siblings can make a reasonable decision quickly together, like, do you want ham or turkey? So how many times does mom wind up cooking both for Christmas because the kids can't decide? So you don't want those kind of people making decisions for you. You want to name them in some sort of order. There's no limit to how many successor agents you can have. And once you've named an agent, it's not like they cannot seek input from others. Your spouse is probably going to seek input from children or siblings, from other trusted advisors before they make a decision. So would your kids. So again, don't worry about naming a committee just so someone's feelings aren't hurt. And again, picking your agent wisely. We've already talked about some of the key attributes of trustworthiness, the ability to advocate, the willingness, having the time to do it. Stress the importance of understanding this is not control over you. This is an extension of your control. There's an escape hatch. If you decide you don't like your agent, or if your agent becomes unwilling or unable, you can always revoke or revise your document. Likewise, if you're too difficult, they can quit. They can resign. It's not indentured servitude. I do remind my mom about that sometimes. You don't get to quit as a daughter, but anyway. So when you're naming your healthcare power of attorney, and you're giving someone authority specifically to make not just medical decisions, but healthcare decisions, and statutorily there is a definition difference there. So your healthcare power of attorney will reference healthcare decisions. And the important thing here is after you've got your document, you've named your agent, they know, we can find the document, you empower that person with having conversations. You talk to them about how you would want decisions made in certain circumstances. There are if you don't know how to start, there's planning tools. There's all kinds of free, downloadable references and tools, things from the American Bar Association to the Conversation Project. Another tool that's readily available is something called 5 Wishes. You may have heard about it. 5 Wishes is the closest thing to a universal health care advance directive that exists in our country. It's statutorily compliant in 42 states. You can, I think you can still download a free single copy from the website. I'm sure if you just Google 5 Wishes, it'll come up. No, I can't remember the exact website right now. And it's not really a commercial for them, but it is a good little tool to help you get started having the conversation. Because the piece of paper is not very, it's not omnipotent. It does not invest in that person the knowledge and awareness of how you would want end-of-life decisions made. It is knowing you and loving you and knowing what you would want, and you have to talk about it even if it's uncomfortable. It is almost guaranteed to reduce family conflict because of proper planning. It is a gift to your family. So some of the hard decisions that are going to come up, a lot of non-clinicians may be in the audience, and you may think your decision-making is simple as, I don't want heroic measures, I don't want a ventilator or a respirator, I would not want CPR if my heart stopped, I don't want a tube feeding. Well, that's a fairly finite sort of statement. Under what circumstances would you or would you not want to be tooth faired? What if you could manage it yourself, but you had some sort of digestive system problem that made you? What if, there's going to be decisions as a dementia progresses, and this was true of my dad. We saw this happen. As the dementia progresses, there becomes nutrition problems related to swallowing problems. So we're having swallowing problems. We know we're not going to do tube feeding because at a point of incapacity, not understanding the procedure, not understanding the thing. But what about hand feeding? How do you know if that person's hungry? Now, personally, I say if my little mouth opens up, I want somebody to put some food in it, But not everybody feels that way. What about altered diets? Mechanically soft diets, chopped up meat, ground up meat, mystery meat. What about stuff with thickened liquids? Because I can't swallow, the speech therapist wants you to put some thickening agent in the water. That sounds like, so now I'm drinking thick. They say it doesn't change. It changes the texture, I guarantee you. Okay, so those are decision making. Those are questions that you go through at that point in time. The other thing that happens a lot with the advanced dementias, the aspiration pneumonia, do we treat it? Do we treat the pneumonia? That's going to be a conversation between you and a physician, you as a person who can be an agent for your loved one with the advanced disease, someone that can take in information and make an informed consent decision. Power of attorneys are like insurance. You hope you never have to need it, to use it, but when you do, you're glad you got a good one, right? So, do I have a living will or an advanced care plan? Tennessee kind of moved away from the term living will, but a lot of us, it's still real familiar to a lot of us. Living wills can often be misconstrued. It's one of the negatives about a living will. It can be misconstrued as a DNR when that's not what it is. It can be interpreted that I have a living will, so that is going to direct how I am taken care of. Well, by statute, the living will only applies in terminal illness situations. It's very narrow in scope, so I would encourage to review that and perhaps have an advanced care plan, which is broader and applies to an approach of care. It's broader in scope and it's going to help guide people in making decisions. But a healthcare power of attorney person, an agent, naming a healthcare person is still preferable because that person is going to be making the informed consent. And hopefully that person is also an informed, activated person, someone that knows your wishes. If you are an unsupported elder, someone with minimal support systems in your life, well, you may need a detailed advanced care plan because there may not be the person, the living advocate there for you. You may have to rely on your physician's interpretation of your advanced care plan for decision making. So, surrogate decision making in review. There are powers of attorney. There can be durable general. Durable just means, by the way, durable means that it transcends incapacity. It is assumed that you have mental capacity when you execute your power of attorney, and that document is still valid and legal and enforceable after you no longer have capacity. It does not transcend death. So the power of attorney loses effectiveness when the principal has passed away. So durable general power of attorney, healthcare power of attorney, living will or advanced directives or advanced care plans, and the post form, the physician's set of orders, are all documents that can help guide your physician. You know, there's a bit of a debate whether or not advance directives are really a medical problem or a medical issue or a legal issue. And I say there are so many people that need it and need to be taught how to use it that I don't care if it starts at your doctor's office with a conversation with your doctor and then you involve your attorneys, or if it starts the other way around. I think it's more important that you have it. You do need to talk to your physician to make sure they know who your appointed healthcare decision makers are going to be. But it really doesn't matter where the chain of events were initiated. Okay, we're down to our last little bullet here. So what about a will? How important is a will? And I told you that in your legal documents, your estate planning documents, your most important tools are your healthcare power of attorney and your durable general power of attorney. But what about a will? A will determines how assets or property will pass at your death. Someone that is named an executor has no authority, doesn't even have a role until there is a death and the will has been entered into the probate process. Some people think because they have a will, they avoid probate. A will will take you to the probate court. It is nothing more than a dear diary document until you actually take it to court. And an attorney and your executor stand in front of the judge and say, yes, Your Honor, I promise this is the document, and we will faithfully execute the terms of this document. So some assets will pass by will, or could pass by will. This is also the point in time where you could use an alternate testamentary document called a trust. A trust has an active role during your life, and the trustee authorities will transcend the grantor's death, and it does avoid probate. The trust may do many other things for you. It may create financial eligibility for some means-tested government programs. It may avoid, certainly will avoid probate. It may allow for management of assets to care for an incapacitated person. It lets you put conditions upon inheritances that you probably couldn't incorporate in your will. I love drafting trusts. And trusts come in a variety of forms, and it allows you to be fairly creative. And it's all about what's the purpose that this document's trying to fulfill for you. But assets also pass other ways other than a will. And some of these other methods of transferring assets at death will supersede the provisions in a will. By operation of law, like a joint tenant's rights of entirety, so that's for married people. You have assets together. You have a joint tenants that will transcend ownership, that will transcend death. You can have bank accounts jointly with a right of survivorship. Contracts. An example of a contract might be your life insurance, and you have beneficiary designations on your life insurance. You also have beneficiary designations on your retirement accounts, like IRAs and 401ks. So, lots of ways for assets to pass at death. If you do absolutely nothing, there is a method for assets to pass. It is called the state's law of intestate succession. And that means your assets are going to pass the way the state thinks your assets should pass, primarily to your spouse and to your children. If you don't have spouses and children, then they find other people that will take your stuff. Family, usually family. People ask, is it too soon to start planning? Well, it's never too soon to start planning unless you truly do not have anyone or anything in your life that you want to protect. Is it too late to plan? It's never too late to plan until you lose capacity. Now, Everybody's got that date marked in your calendar, right? You know when you're going to lose capacity, so you know you've got to get your estate plan done before that. So that's sort of the point. We don't know. Even if we have a diagnosis that has a trajectory that is going to probably end with loss of capacity, that does not make us immune from car accidents and falling off the ladder or having a stroke or other things that happen to people every day that change the course of our life. I think, oh, by the way, do you know what the number one reason for not having estate planning documents? It's probably true in this room too. You just haven't gotten around to it. Just never made time for it. I know I need to do it one day. It's been on our bucket list for years. I think it is a loving gesture. I think it's one of the most romantic things I have seen families, couples come in to do, is you spent your whole life together, you spend a lot of your life planning on taking care of each other. You have life insurance policies, you have savings, you've made probably children and memories together, and you want their future to go on when you've passed. I've been so touched by so many times when I've had a man that knew he was dying, maybe cancer, and he comes in and he's planning to make sure that his wife is taken care of. He's leaving a legacy. It's not left to chance. The affairs are in order. And the family's not scrambling at death. They know what the plan is. And they knew what the plan was to take care of him and to how he would want things to be. And I think that is, it's dignified and it's loving and it's not expensive or painful. It doesn't have to be. So I am willing, if I have time, I lose sense of time, but if we have time, we can do questions.
So everybody who hasn't planned for their estate, as Barbara said, or doesn't have a will, don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Why?
Okay.
I have found from 3 lawyers, including Kim, I believe one,
Okay.
that joint JTROS is not valid in Tennessee.
A right of survivorship is valid.
But it's not called that thing. Okay, thank you. That clarifies. Number 2, I almost got to the point where I was about to impose DNR on me. I've had 2 cases where it will not be honored in advance.
Yeah. So you're talking about the tattoo, the DNR tattoo? Yeah. So one of the things that we do, it's not tattoos, but we do a television show on channel 50 plus, and it is devoted to elder law topics. And it's 50 plus, it's the channel 5 affiliate. 50 plus.
It's in the 50s.
It's in the 50s. Start searching for us. It's the channel 5 affiliate. So it's where Morning Line, Open Line is. On Friday mornings, we have Take Us McGinnis Elder Law Hour. And this current month is, what's running right now is a whole session on advanced directives, because on the 14th of this month was National Healthcare Decision Making Day. And so we had a primary care physician come on and talk about how to have that conversation. You know, the doctors try, it's on their list, they mean to, but if you bring it up first, you're not out of line, you're fine. The second person that was on was an EMS provider from Lieutenant Boyd from Sumner County. I asked him the question about the tattoo, and he said, of course, that will not work. And no, he's never seen it. The third person, an ER physician. What's going to happen if you show up in the ER with or without an advanced directive? What are they going to do? They're probably going to try to medically stabilize you first. Then they're going to figure out if you have an advanced directive and who's your decision maker. The other people on the show were some folks from hospice, and how once you've made a hospice election, how perhaps your care planning and your documents are going to change. So, now we go back to his first question about right of survivorship. You can own real estate. Now you own real estate by a deed. If you're married, it's tenants by the entirety. You actually have to state in the document that you don't want to own it as tenants by the entirety if you own it with your spouse. I can't think of a good reason why you would want to do that, but we work on that. Then, if you own it with someone else that is not a spouse, it is going to be assumed you own it as tenants in common, which does not have a right of survivorship. So you have to state you want a right of survivorship. For real estate, bank accounts, you're a joint owner, and it's going to pass to the joint owner. Last man standing is going to owns that bank account. All right. I've either bored everybody or you guys have got this completely down. There's somebody back there.
Next question.
So power of attorney and conservatorship, which one would you do and why would you choose one over the other? And does the person have to be mentally stable to sign for conservatorship, or how does that work?
So power of attorney versus a conservatorship. If at all possible, we always start with a power of attorney, the durable general power of attorney. The person that is giving away, not really giving away authority, but consenting to having the document done, that's called the principal. That person does have to have capacity. Capacity and competency are two different, often mistakenly interchangeable terms. Competency is something declared by a court of law. Capacity is about decision making. Do they understand what decision they're being asked to make? Can they express an opinion about that? And always start with it's less costly, it's less invasive, it's easier to work with. The conservatorship involves a court proceeding, sometimes multiple attorneys. Just finished up a conservatorship where there was 5 attorneys involved. One old person, 5 attorneys. We haven't got all the bills in yet for that. So a conservatorship can be very expensive, I think less dignified. It is a safety net for an incapacitated person that never got around to it.
We got a question up there, the gentleman. We're just passing around the mic. The mic is behind you, sir. So everybody can hear.
Can you convert a will to a trust, and should this be done?
Can you convert a will to a trust? You can always revise or revoke your will and replace it with a trust. And that is really, that question about why or if you should do that, that's the value of your attorney, because it depends on what your estate planning goals are. There's a lot of do-it-yourself information out there on the internet about estate planning, and your documents that can be created can be very beautiful documents, but they may or may not say what you want them to say, because the decision-making process is really where your attorneys are in its keep. But some of the reasons why you would convert a will to a trust would avoid the avoidance of the probate. Another byproduct of even a revocable trust is it allows asset management for a person with incapacity or impaired capacity to, I think it protects vulnerable adults sometimes. Because if you're serving as a power of attorney for someone with impaired decision making, that person has not lost any authority. They can still go to the bank and write checks. And so that person can be taken advantage of. Scammers, grandchildren, multiple, because all of our medical bills come perfect, right? And we never overpay or have any problems with our medical bill payment system. You know, those kind of things. So if you're the trustee of someone that has impaired capacity because by virtue of a revocable trust, well then you, as trustee, and only you, have access to the assets inside the trust. So it helps protect vulnerable older adults, vulnerable adults of any age.
Barbara, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Don't forget, you have your evaluations. As I stated before, it's very important to us to receive your comments. It helps us better plan as we move on with our Educating America tour. Some housekeeping. We're going to take a 10 to 15 minute break, but before we do that, we have some more gifts to give out. But before we do that, part of what I explained to you before is that part of the charge of the board of directors is for us to support our member organizations and fund research. When AFA receives donations that are dedicated to research, 100% of that funds go into a dedicated account and is given out to research facilities all over the world for better treatment or cure. 88 cents of every other dollar goes to our programs and services. Today, one of the recipients of one of our 5 grant cycles is here for the Caregiver Relief Program at Bedford County. Joyce, come on up. It's a check for $5,000 for you. You can't cash this, but the check's on its way. You've heard that before, right? Checks in the mail, but this one is legit. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations. So we have some more prizes to give out, but before we do that, you know, we have some tables that are here and some exhibitors, and it's so critically important. This is part of the tour that we bring the services to you. They have a wealth of information. During the break, take advantage and meet them. On my left side is the Vanderbilt University Center for Cognitive Medicine. 50 forward is here, Senior Helpers, Music and Memory. The Takis McGinnis Elder Care Law Firm is outside. Mental Health America of Mid-South and Greater Nashville region. Regional Council is here to my right. Take advantage of that. But we have 2 more prizes to give out. Chris, we have a lithograph of Eddie George, and the recipient of that was a gentleman from Kentucky, Derek Hort. Derek, just what you came here for. Picture of a former Tennessee Titan. Yeah, and who's this? Ryan Ellis autograph, Mitty Helmet, co-captain of the alternate captain of the Predators, and who's the recipient? Paul Sexton. Paul, where are you? Here we go. So we're going to take a quick 10 to 15 minute break. This is, the restrooms are right outside. Lunch is being served. And then when you come back, we're going to wrap up today's session with Healing Memory Through the Power of Music from Deborah Ferris from Music and Memory. 10 minutes.